Thanks, Rick. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land in which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, particularly those that are in the room. Thank you for the introduction, Rick. So as Rick said, my name's Liam. I run a research unit based at Monash University called Behavioural Australia. We do lots and lots of applied behaviour change research in collaboration with government departments, really to try and get behaviour change for individual benefit or social benefit. I must confess to being a bit of an imposter in this circumstance though, because I haven't worked and my unit hasn't worked at all on alcohol and drug behaviour change challenges. I don't pretend that anything I offer you today is the solution. I don't pretend that anything I offer you today will work, but it is my assessment of some of the tools that exist that have been really come out of the literature perhaps, well, over the last 50 years, but nicely packaged up over the past 5 or 10 years, that it may be useful in some of the interactions you have and the work you do in alcohol and drug rehabilitation. So I don't pretend to know what you know, and I don't pretend, as Rick said, to replace existing practice. Very much complement it is the idea. So I guess I'm going to structure this talk into 3 parts. The first part is I'm going to go through a few lessons about what not to do. So we work a lot with government in behaviour change programs, and as you can probably guess, we see lots of, we call them mistakes. It's a bit of a harsh word because I think it's well intended. But we see a lot of things being done by government that can sometimes make the outcome worse than what it would be if they did nothing. And so I want to point out a few of these because I think, you may recognise some of these things, you may not, but they're worth at least considering. The second thing I'm going to talk about is some behavioural insights toolkits. So these I mentioned before about packaging up, I would argue probably 50 or 60 years of good social psychological theory plus a bit of behavioural economics theory into some pretty useful toolkits to how you might change or use them to change behaviour. They're fairly generic toolkits. They work for most behaviours in most circumstances a little bit. Try them on your kids, try them on your friends. They should work a little bit. And then the last section, which is only a couple of slides, because hopefully you'll realise this as we go through the presentation. I just want to turn my attention to my assessment, and that's all it is, of how some of these tools may be useful, some of the issues in alcohol and drug rehabilitation. Now, like I said, that I really want to emphasise that I hope you do kind of the thinking throughout the presentation about how these things might apply for yourself. And so forgive me my naivety at the end. So I'm going to go through 3 really common mistakes we see in behaviour change. And the first one really is when people jump in and try and solve problems without really unpacking them and understanding them. And that probably resonates quite a lot with the work that you do. And I just want to use a really simple exemplar, which is some work we did with Vic Roads, which I'll have a couple of examples on later on. But in your mind's eye, I want you to picture someone who's been reported by the Roads Authority as being medically unfit to drive. This person is medically unfit to drive. Has anyone got a picture in their mind? Yeah. Hands up if you had someone who looked like this. Few? Great. Hands up if you had someone who looked like this. Few, okay. If you answered the latter, you're actually a little bit more right than the former, because it's actually, there's quite a strong body of evidence that shows that women self-regulate out of cars, but men tend to stay in cars until probably when they shouldn't be. So you probably need a crowbar to get some men out. But you might be surprised to see that this is the data of the age of people reported to Vic Roads for being medically unfit to drive in 2016. It's the age profile. Now, just by looking at one graph, it makes you realise that maybe the assumptions you had about the target audience aren't quite what you thought they might be. Any observations from this graph here?
16-year-olds.
A lot of 16-year-olds. Why might that be? Underlying medical conditions. So when they first drive. Okay. So for those people, we might have a different strategy, right? Maybe they suffer from epilepsy or some other illness that only really becomes a problem when they start to learn to drive. The other kind of take home from this for me was that it's not as skewed up one end as you might think. In fact, it's actually the... Sorry, what was that?
Should only drive once you hit 95.
There you go. There you go. you know, and the average, I think 2/3 of the audience are under age 75, right? And 75 is like the new 20 or something, right? So, you know, we don't think of that as being so old anymore. So actually, we'd be really wrong. I'm really making a very a simple point here, which is don't assume. I think, and we see so many programs that assume to know who their target audience is. A kind of a second mistake that we really commonly see is the idea that I know what works. I know what will change behaviour. And there are some different parts to this. I'm going to point out 3 of the sort of the sub-themes that sit underneath this. And the first one, which you're probably familiar with, is that information and knowledge changes people paper. So if we tell them people stuff, then they'll change behaviour. They'll care about the issue, or they'll want to do something, and they'll change about their behaviour. This is a good example of it. This is from a cycling promotion fund. So this is about trying to get people to ride their bikes more to and from, particularly commuting. And essentially what they're saying in this picture is that the amount of road space that cyclists use is not very much, and it's sort of roughly the same as public transport, but then if you drive the car, then it takes up a huge amount of road space, right? And the caption with this it was quite a large campaign, mostly overseas. Mostly in New South Wales, said, now they'll get it. Convincing the world that bike transport is highly efficient, save the taxpayer a fortune, has never been easy, but this new photograph should help. So who rode here today? Now you've seen this image, all the rest of you, now you've seen this image, who's going to ride here tomorrow? One! Oh, so you're not in the target audience, right? The point I'm trying to make here again is that we think these messages might be powerful and they might work, but actually just till we do a quick straw poll around the room, it makes no difference to behaviour, does it? Just by telling people, apart from the logic of the information, which I don't fully understand anyway, you know, it's not necessarily compelling. And I wanted to just talk through a really, it's kind of a funny example, but it's kind of sad in one way. It also points out, I guess, how common this practice is. This is an example really close to home. This is an example of a group called the Office of Environment and Sustainability based at Monash University, who are trying to get people, academics, to switch off a light when they left a lunchroom. So they had a lunchroom, about half the size of this room, and as we left, a bit like there's a light switch just there, they wanted people to switch it off on the way out. And so they thought about the target audience, at least that's a good sign, at least they thought about the target audience and said, well, they're academics, they believe in climate change, so we need to convince them that if they switch off the light, it will save greenhouse gases, and that's good. So they put a little sign over the switch and says, be energy smart, if you're the last to leave, switch off, help reduce Monash's greenhouse emissions. Do you think this got people to change their behaviour? No, it was ineffective. But they did stop there because they realised that, okay, that didn't work. They thought, well, maybe that's not the issue. Maybe it's not the fact about it that it reduces greenhouse gas emissions that convince people. Maybe it's the fact that people don't know where the light switch is. So we got a sign that said switch off the light. Here it is. Great. So we know the light switch is there. And we've got all this information about saving greenhouse gas emissions. It didn't work. So what was the next sign we got? Well, they went back to the drawing board and they thought, the problem is people think if you switch the light off and then on again, you use more energy than if you just leave it on, right? So that's the information that people need. So we've got this nice big post up that says, please, you know, do it. If you switch it on and off, it uses no less power, much less power than if you leave it on. That didn't work either. So the next sign, which is probably one that's quite familiar to you, particularly around lunchrooms, looks something like this. And you probably, yeah, like I say, you've probably seen this in your kitchenettes at lunch, right? Most people have, right? The point really was, I think this audience were well intended and they were providing lots of information that they thought would work, but none of it was effective. By the way, it got automated by the solution. So that's the first one, that information and knowledge will change people's behaviour. Another one is incentives. We just need to provide people with incentives, particularly financial incentives, but not always. There's a couple of great studies, you might be familiar with them. One from the 70s that Titmus did around asking people to donate blood. There was a group of people were offered who were already donating blood. A group of people were offered $7, a financial incentive of $7. In the 70s is probably about $20 or $30 now, to donate blood. And what do you think happened when that happened, when they offered the incentive for people to do it? blood donations dropped. Why?
It's a negative connotation, like I don't need your money.
A bit of that really. It's actually, it's pretty much the fact that people weren't doing it for money. They were doing it for other reasons. And by paying them, it almost was insulting, right? Because that's not why I do it.
It also makes it look like there might be a problem with, if you have to give money to people, maybe there's a risk involved, or maybe.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So there might be a bunch of reasons. And another great one, study from more recently done in Israel, where a fine was introduced. Who has kids that they take to childcare? What's the punishment if you are late? All sorts of stuff. The best one I've heard is that your kids get taken to the police station. Others have sort of $1 a minute and all those sorts of things, right? So there's lots of different things. But there was no punishment, and they introduced a fine in Israel. And what happened? Late pickups doubled. Why? Because they'd priced something that was unpriced before. So you need to be a little bit careful with incentives. I say this with some caution because incentives can be very effective in some circumstances, not always. Uri Nisi, who's a well-known behavioural economist, says pay enough or don't pay at all. So that's the second one, incentives. So this is still under this banner of I know what works. The first one was information would change. Second is around incentives. And the third one, which is one that is probably the least well known, I think, is when we try and tell people about the size of the problem that we're trying to change. So here's a really big problem. You need to change your behaviour to try and fix it. You understand that? And we see this all the time. But before I explain that in detail, I want to explain the underlying principle of it. Not the underlying principle. An underlying principle is important to explain something in the next slide. The principle is that humans like to be normal. We like to follow norms and we like to follow what others do. It's in our nature. And a really good example of that is energy bills. Who's got an energy bill that tells you what your neighbours are using? Right? Yeah, many of you, right? And do you know what happens? If I was to ask most of you if that affects your behaviour, most of you would tell me, no, doesn't change my behaviour. Fact is, huge studies have shown it does change your behaviour. Only a small bit, about 4, 5, 6% energy reduction, depending on the target audience, but it does change behaviour. And so by telling people, you can bring people to that norm. The very first study that was done on this was really interesting because they told people what their neighbours were using. And all the people who were using lots of energy, they came down to be more normal. You know where I'm going. All the people who were using less energy, they came up by the same percentage. So we all gravitated to the norm. And if you asked anyone if it affected behaviour, no, it didn't affect my behaviour, but yet it did. We know it. The point really is we like to be seen as normal and we follow what we think is normal. Right? Good? Understand the principle. So what happens when, say, an Environmental Protection Agency authority here in Victoria runs a campaign that says, this is how much litter is pulled out of Port Phillip every day. The average Victorian litter is 2.8 kilos per person per year. What does that tell you? I'm not littering, you know. Exactly what it tells you. That's exactly what it tells you. And I can guarantee, and we know this from lots of other situations, that that would result in increasing the amount of people littering. Littering's one thing. That's what I talk about family violence. What happens if we talk about the fact that people die every week in family violence? What happens if we talk about the fact that ABC used to have a rolling counter of family violence incidences attended by police that rolls into the several hundreds, if not thousands. You can watch it tick over. What does it tell you is normal? Or common at least. So we often deliver these messages that tell people the size of a problem, but actually we create a rod for our own back. So I had a look at the Turning Point website. I know not everyone's from Turning Point, right? But one of the words that we often see is the word crisis. And this wasn't Turning Point work, but it was from The Guardian. But nonetheless, it talks about a crisis. And it says, the underlying message underneath this is basically that there's this whole spate of fentanyl-related deaths that are growing and growing and growing. What does that tell you? It's common. It's relatively normal. So it can create problems. Incidentally, this is also off the Turning Point website. This is good norms, most of this. So, you know, we'd had this many students, we had lots of engagement, we had 170 publications. Even this is probably a good normative message, saying lots of people come to us to help. So but you just need to be careful with norms. And we see it all the time of people saying there's an obesity epidemic or a drugs epidemic or an alcohol, whatever. And we're really trying to draw attention to an issue, but actually we might be making it worse at the same time. That's not to discredit the people that do really noble lobbying work to try and get issues on the agenda. That's really important. But once they are on the agenda, I think we should stop talking so publicly about the volume of numbers. And many of you probably dealt with or deal with people around suicide, and you'll know that there's not common reporting of suicide. There's two reasons for that. One is to prevent copycat suicide attempts. The other one is that actually by pointing out how many people commit suicide every year, you normalise it. So expressing things in that is really important. The third mistake we see is we have one strategy and one strategy only. So here I go, this is the way I'm going to change behaviour, and it's going to work to solve a really big complex public policy challenge. We know that really good examples, and I'll give you a couple. Smoking, for example, this is smoking rates from the early 80s where approximately a third of people smoked, to late, sort of about 10 or 15 years ago when we got to about 15%, and the trend graph actually continues even further up until 2014 where we've got sort of 6 or 7% smoking. The reason that worked is not one thing, it's combinations of things over long periods of time. So governments that are after silver bullets, they really work. Another great one is obviously road safety, where we peaked in the 70s, and some of you may remember the Declare War on 1034 campaign and how that all sparked a whole big move for road safety. Okay, so there are three there, I think, really common mistakes. There are actually some others, and using mistakes is probably a bit of a harsh word, but the point really is you may recognise some of those things in some work you do, maybe you don't, but they're worth thinking about anyway. Do I really understand my target audience? Am I delivering a message that I think will work on me, but may not work on them? So when you use yourself as the test case, you're actually really flawed in your thinking, right? Because you're not like your target audience. I often have a slide here and say, who's the target audience that's most not like me? And I put up a picture of Collingwood fans. So, but it's really trying to emphasise that point that people who you're trying to persuade to do things don't think like you, they don't act like you, they are different to you. And so what would work on you probably may work on them too, but may not. So understanding people's drivers of behaviour is really important. Right, I'm going to shift angles a little bit now to talk about a couple of behaviour change toolkits. I'm not going to talk about all of the features of these toolkits because they're actually quite large, but so I'm pull out a couple of principles, I guess, that I think are important and maybe useful around the alcohol and drug related space. The first one was written by a guy called Bob Cialdini. Bob Cialdini is a well-known social psychologist. He's probably first started publishing in the 70s, but wrote a book in the late 80s, I think, called Influence, Science and Practice. Some of you may have read it. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. It's the sort of book you can pick up and read really easily. And he talks about 6 principles of persuasion. They include social proof, which is about what's normal, so that we've already talked a little bit about that. They include commitment and reciprocity, which I'll come back to in a minute. Liking, so we tend to comply with requests from people we like, and we like people who are similar to us, who we find attractive. We tend to comply with authority. People in uniforms, people who are tall, people who have titles. We tend to comply with these sorts of people. As a general rule, not always, but as a general rule. And we tend to chase things that we perceive to be scarce. One time only offer. Only 3 flights left at this price. We chase it. I mean, humans like, FOMO is real, right? But the 2 I really want to single out and talk in just a little bit of detail are commitment and consistency. Commitment and consistency and reciprocity. The principle of commitment and consistency is essentially that if we can get someone to make a commitment to do something in the future, they're more likely to follow through on it. And as you'll see in the next toolkit, there's some further detail on exactly how you can do that. But that's the general principle. And there are ways of making us more consistent with that commitment. And there are three kind of ingredients, I think, that Cialdini talks about anyway, that help people make good on their commitments. Number one is that if the commitment is an active commitment, we know it's more likely to be followed through with. So an active commitment is not one where I say, so will you come to your appointment next week at 4 o'clock on Tuesday? And the person says yes. That's not active. An active commitment is, here's an appointment card, fill it out. And they write it down. Tuesday, 4 o'clock at such and such. That very simple switch of me asking and all you have to do is say yes or no, to actually making and doing something active in the action of making the commitment increases the likelihood people will do it quite significantly. One of the studies that was done in the UK, I'm going to forget the exact figure, but it was done around national health appointments, which we know are problematic in the UK, which has obviously universal healthcare and free. And so people not turning up is actually quite costly to the system. So they got a whole bunch of people to fill out their own appointment cards, and a test group and a control group who just got the normal, whatever it was, told when the appointment was. And they were able to increase, I think, by about a third the number of people coming to appointments on time by a very simple shift in making the commitment active rather than a passive thing. Does that make sense? So commitments are more likely to be followed through with if they're active. They're also more likely to be followed through with if they're effortful. So it takes effort to make the commitment itself. Clicking on something is relatively effortless. It doesn't require a lot of work. But to turn up somewhere to make a commitment or to go somewhere. So if you, just something really simple, if you want me to turn up to the next one of these and I sign there versus walking down the corridor and finding a booth around the corner and signing there, it's slightly more effortful and you're more likely to comply with it. Make sense? Active, effortful. And the third one, which is really the magic ingredient for commitments, may be relevant to your work or not, are commitments that are made public. So the more public you can make a commitment, the more likely it will be adhered to. If people make a commitment on social media, or if you're able to create a list of people somewhere that says these people have made a commitment to doing this, people are much more likely to follow through on that commitment. Yes?
Can I just ask about that? Does that have to be totally voluntary in nature, or what if it's mandated with public? Does the mandated nature affect it?
So any research we would, I'm just trying to think of anywhere where it's been compulsory. I can't think of any research where it's been compulsory. It would normally, you'd ask people. But if they're making a commitment, they made a commitment, right? So do you mind if we publish this or share this on our networks or whatever like that? Or with this audience, it might not have to be everyone, but with this particular audience, then most people will comply with that request because they've just made that commitment anyway, and that will increase the odds that they'll follow through on it. Yep.
So can we go back to social proof and what that means?
So I talked about norms before. We all like to be normal. So social proof basically means everyone's doing it, so there's proof it's the right thing to do, so I follow norms. And I'll get to the norms, I'm going to go back to norms in a minute with the next toolkit as well. Reciprocity is another really key one, which is this idea that when someone gives to us, we feel obliged to repay them, right? And that giving doesn't have to be a thing. If it is a thing, great, then it's probably a bit more tangible, but it can also be some knowledge or some piece of gossip, potentially, that people will be obliged to repay us back. The Hare Krishnas knew this. They've sort of disappeared now, but sort of 20 and 30 years ago, it was very common to be stopped in the streets and being given a flower or given a book. And most people, when you give them something, they take it off you. Right? It's a natural reaction. So we take things. And then the Hare Krishnas would say, can you donate to our fund? And then people would say, actually, I don't want the book. No, the book's a gift, but can you donate? And people would feel very obliged to donate, and they would, right? So it's this feeling of reciprocity that really is powerful drive. And obviously we see this on social media all the time. When someone likes you or something you post, you feel obliged to repay them, right? The next time they post something. We see that. The interesting thing about reciprocity is that it fades over time. Actually, it fades over time for the receiver. It grows over the time for the giver. So in other words, if I give someone something now, they'll feel indebted to me immediately, but they might forget about it in a month or 2 months or 3 months. But I'll remember. You remember that time when I gave... And it's shown to work that way. So if you are using reciprocity as a principle for persuasion, give and give genuinely, but you need to ask for the favour in return quickly. And it's not an exchange, it's a genuine gift, and people can choose not to reciprocate. Of course, that's fine. And this has been shown in studies and in a number of areas. The most recent one I've read about was in people trying to get people to use private health insurance rather than Medicare for hospital performances, when they were given a little toolkit and then asked to use their private health insurance. So reciprocity. So there are two that I think may have some application to the work you do. I'm not sure, but they may do. Inspire is an interesting framework that we put together, particularly for written communication. And I know you do some written communication with patients and clients, and I wanted to go through this framework, which a colleague of mine at Behavioural developed, called Inspire. I don't want to go through all the letters. I'm only going to go through 4 of the 7, the I, N, S, and E, because I don't think the other 3 are that applicable. So this is back to that commitment strategy. I stands for implementation intentions. If we make a commitment to do something and we're asked to form some really detailed plans about doing that behaviour, including some of the barriers that might stop us and how we might address those barriers. If we can have those mental models in our head, we're more likely to follow through. It's a kind of a commitment strategy, right? And it's been shown to be really effective. In fact, you know, the basketballers in America, they get people to shut their eyes before they shoot, say from the free throw line, because it increases the likelihood they'll do it, because they're forming plans in their head. And it's been shown to work, right? Just forming a plan and visualising the behaviour in your head is more effective. So that you can certainly ask people to do that, but you can also get them to write it down. I talked about writing down appointment times. That can be really great. One of the very seminal works was done on flu vaccination rates. So that was the difference between people who were in a control and a test group, of people that wrote down their plans to get the group or not. Not actually as significant as the one from the health sector, which I need to probably put up in here as well. And VicRoads took away the stickers on our cars. Who knows why? So we all don't know when our registration comes up, right? And you'd be surprised to hear this. I probably shouldn't say it, but I will. About 30% of people don't renew their registration on time, and a majority of them don't do it because they just forget. And then they get fined, including the former commissioner. So, you know, writing and putting these plans in, we've done some trials with VicRoads around these sorts of things, and it does prove effective, right? So that's the I for implementation intentions. Norms, again, we've talked about these. We tend to follow what people do on their masses, or what people think we ought to do, what other people think we ought to do. And I guess there's 2 types of norms, and these are psychobabble, so forgive me. One is the descriptive norm, which is about describing what most people do. So if you see a line queuing up for something and you've just arrived somewhere, you probably join that queue, right? Why? You may not know what they're even queuing up for, but you know that there's probably some reason for it. So you want to join the queue, right? And you watch videos on YouTube because 15 million other people have, right? And you want to see what other people are watching. So we follow what we seem as normal. We talked about that already. The other type, of course, is the normative power we receive from people who matter to us. So they are influential to us as normal. They're called injunctive norms. I have no idea why. It's just a term. But essentially they're people who matter to us, whose opinions matter to us, who can be persuasive. We've talked about this in our energy bills, and I won't go into that. But it is important to think about what norms you are talking to people about. And I've got some suggestions for that right at the end. Salience. If you are communicating to someone through static or written communication rather than face-to-face, obviously face-to-face is better. Over the phone is better than face-to-face. But if you are communicating to people through written form, One of the things that you really need to do is think about how you make your message salient, how you make it prominent, how people even pay attention to it. Because if it's a whole really long letter with 15 clauses about why you have to do something or not do something straight from some act that you've never heard of, it's unlikely people will engage with it. So salience is really important. So we know that things that are, for example, and these are just some of the tricks that you might want to think about when things are handwritten, rather, particularly if you have a signature. If you have a handwritten one rather than a printed one, it works better. More people will pay attention. This is all backed up by research and evidence, by the way. Pictures can grab attention in focusing, capturing and holding people's attention using their name rather than just dear person. Registered post obviously attracts, if you're sending letters out, and if you have multiple stamps, people are more likely to open it. There you go. Also brown envelopes. If you send things in brown envelopes, people are more likely to open them than white. So there's a whole bunch of little tricks in there that you can use, particularly if you're sending letters out to people. And they apply to email as well. Not all of them, but a lot of them apply to email as well. The last one, which I think is often the most overlooked sort of principle of persuasion or behaviour change, is the idea that you really need to make the target behaviour, the thing you want people to do, as easy as possible. We've worked on so many programs with government where people have to log in and register. And once you log in and register, then you can get some application that you need to download, and then you can put in your data, and then you can try and get some answer that says what you might want it to do. Or something like that. The more steps you have involved, the less likely people will do it. It sounds so obvious. And Richard Thaler, who wrote the book Nudge, I don't know if everyone's read Nudge, but he says in interviews, if I could do 10 things to change people's behaviour, the first 9 would be to make it easy. And the 10th, I might try and work on motivation. Where if you look at government, 10 of the things work on motivation, 9 of the things, work on motivation, and the last thing they do is try and make it easy. I say that facetiously, I don't think that's always the case, but it is often the case. So make it easy, make it easy, make it easy, make it easy. Just think about what you're asking someone to do and what's the easiest way, what's the easiest path for them. How do you make it so easy that it's almost hard not to do it? Easy also comes in the form of how you communicate. You're not meant to read this, sorry, it's a letter that we drafted. It was actually related to that very first slide, or one of the first slides I put up around people who were medically unfit to drive, and what they are supposed to do is go off and get a medical check and then send in the paperwork into the Vic Roads to say, yes, I can drive, or no, I can't. And we redrafted that letter and were able to increase by about a quarter the number of people actually doing what they were supposed to do. But one of the key things we did was really introduce really simple headings to break up the text. And one of those headings should say, what you need to do. The first step of this medical review is to provide us a medical report from a doctor. Ideally, we could also send them a text. We could even set up an appointment for them. Do you want us to set up an appointment for you? We'll do that. Or we've already set one for you up for you with some, if you've already, I don't know how they would know a doctor, but we've already set one up, or we're happy to set you one up for you. If you don't want to, if you want to use a different doctor, fine. You can choose to do that. Right? And then the second heading, when you need to do it. What you need to do when you need to do it in as simple language as possible. I can't tell you what the letter looked like before this. It was horrible. So that's why we've got a quarter more people submitting their paperwork around being medically fit. So some of the general rules: make it easy to do the behaviour. Place key messages as close to the top as possible. So if you want something to person to do or some outcome, then put that at the top. Don't put it down the bottom. Here's all the logic, and then this is what we need you to do. No, this is what you need to do, and here's all the logic. Right? Understand? Use plain language, headings, list and table, simple words, etc. So the whole bunch of sort of basic, I think, kind of tools there that may be useful. So I was thinking about alcohol and drug treatment, and I know that a lot of your interactions are done initially through telephone. Sometimes they transition to online correspondence and online counselling. And I don't pretend to know the full gamut of even a hundredth of what you do in terms of how you interact with clients. I've put that right at the start, and I'll put it again at the end. But here are some of the things I think are really important. I've sort of talked about the first one straight away. Make things as easy as possible. How could I put myself in that person's shoes and make it so easy it's almost hard to not do the next behaviour? What barriers can I remove for them? Do they have to ring up and make their own appointment, or can I do that for them? Do they have to, buy a MyKey card and get on a tram, or can I do that for them? How many barriers can you think about, and how many can you remove to help that next thing happen? I think this is a really important one. Emphasise that most people recover. Most people recover when they engage in services. I hope this is true. I'd assume it's true. Maybe it takes longer than we thought, but the emphasis, I think, are on the positive messages to individuals. Tell them it's normal, not only to feel these things, but also it's normal to recover. It's normal that large numbers of people recovered. Or, when the numbers don't work in your favour, the other trick that you can use around norming is to emphasise trends, because people like trends. So that if for example, I tell people, last year people in your street, 10% of them, I don't know, did something, put in solar hot water, solar panels. 2 years ago it was 10%. Last year it was 20%. This year it's looking like it's 30%. Oh my God, I've got to jump on that bandwagon. People like trends, and we follow trends. So you can use those trends to support people to say, okay, well, the numbers are increasing. We're getting more and more people recovering. That's a good message. It's one they want to hear and will help them follow through. I've talked about this one already, about personalising communication wherever possible. I think some of these commitment strategies, the effective, effortful and public, are really important, and particularly one of those mechanisms is implementation intentions. So I understand that one of the really big challenges is trying to get people who have phoned up to do the next thing. So I would really encourage you to ask a question about, or encourage people to make plans. So how are you going to do that? Have you thought about how you would get there? Have you thought about, do you know the number to call? Can you tell me some of the barriers that you might have to doing that next thing? And how might we address those barriers? How might I help you address those barriers? And try and get people in their mind to form plans. That's the trick, to form a plan. Even better if they write it down. If you can get people to, I don't know how that works over the phone or online, but whatever mechanism you can get them to make an active commitment to write something down. Helpful. And I guess this seems like manipulation, but I do think in the greater benefit, it's a good thing if there's opportunities to give something to someone where they feel obliged to repay. And I don't know what that thing might be. It might be a piece of information. It might be a brochure. It might be a secret contact of someone who's really good at doing something. But you've given them something, and they feel like they've received something from you. They're more likely to feel the obligation to repay, particularly in the short term. Remember, in the long term, that fades. So I had 40 minutes. I've taken 39 and a half. I'm pretty good, aren't I? So thank you for listening, and I am sticking around for sort of 10 or 15 minutes of questions. Great.
Thanks, Liam.